bill in Fontana, California. It says that you want to debate or disagree with me about raising income taxes on the very rich above 50%. Yeah. Make your case, sir.
Well, I think there is a reason to look at incentive to work, and our tax rates probably now at 39% are probably about right, because you have to add in state taxes, and which
don't exist in Texas and Florida.
Right, but they probably should, because what you got is a situation where a lot of our income tax revenue for states comes from sales taxes. Now, sales taxes cost sales because people try to avoid them. I used to work in an industry where we did a lot of online sales, right. And we had all our biggest sellers did nothing but sell out of state. They never sold in their own state because that way they didn't collect sales tax.
Right.
I realize there is use tax, and the states are starting to enforce it. But I would say that we ought to move away from sales tax on the states and move more towards income taxes, and that we should look at a situation and say the total tax rate should not be so high that it discourages people.
Now, wait a second, Bill. Stop for a second. We had a top income tax rate of 91% from the 1930s until the 1960s, and over 50% from the 1930s to the 1980s. So let's use that 50 years, from the 1930s to the 1980s. We had a period of sustained prosperity, and on top of that, you had wealthy people, CEOs, on average earning only 30 times what their workers made. Now, when Reagan came into office, the largest employer in the United States was General Motors, and GM was paying its employees, in today's dollars, $54 an hour, which, by the way, is what the German average industrial wage is right now. Today, now, after 34 years of Reaganomics and this giant cut in taxes at the top, the CEO of General Motors and all these other CEOs, instead of making 30 times what their workers make, and instead of even living in the same neighborhoods as their workers, as they used to, there's a great piece in Forbes back in the 70s about meet the CEO next door. How they may have two cars instead of one, but that's the big difference. Instead, now the CEOs live in a world apart. They have their private helicopters and their private jets and their private dining room with all the help, because it's all tax deductible, because we changed our tax code to help those guys out. And they're living in a separate world. And now our largest employer is Walmart, and they're paying, in the neighborhood of $10 an hour, less than $10 an hour on average, instead of $50 an hour. It's like, this is the consequence of tax policy.
No, I don't think it is the consequence of tax policy. I think it's the consequence of the decline of unions.
Well, to some extent, it's a consequence of trade policy also. But
I agree with that too.
But the simple reality is that if somebody, your beginning premise was you don't want to discourage work. I don't want to discourage work either. I can't imagine anybody who would say, my first $500,000 was taxed at 35%, and so that's fine. Or even 40%. Actually, the first 100,000 was, because here's how it works. Your first 30 or 40,000 is tax free, and then your next $50,000 or $60,000 is taxed at 10%, and then the next $50,000 or $60,000 is taxed at 20%. And as you make more and more, your tax goes up on that incremental piece. Most people don't realize this is how progressive taxation works. But Bill Gates pays zero income taxes on his first, $10,000, $12,000, whatever the poverty wage is, just like everybody else.
I understand.
Okay.
Yeah, I know. I understand what you're saying.
So why not say, if you want to earn over $500,000, good luck, but you're going to pay 80% or 90% income taxes on it. And at that point, people just say, okay, I'm going to cap my income at $400,000, $500,000 a year and not pay that 90% income tax and use that money to pay my employees.
In a lot of ways, that's what did happen when we had the 90%.
That's exactly what did happen.
Except that what they did was they would buy tax shelters that were oftentimes not really economically a good idea, but it took their tax rate down
Well, that's what Kennedy wanted to undo. And
I know,
and in fact,
he did to some extent.
Yeah.
And I think we should undo a lot of those shelters that have re-risen and do rise every few years, and that would be a good idea.
Yeah.
And we probably
but here's the simple math, Bill. When you look at not just the United States but other countries as well, and I encourage you to look back at these articles that I've written about this, Larry Beinhart has written about this, and others have written about it. When the top tax rate, income tax rate, federal income tax rate, yes, you're right. States add things onto that, and there's other things get added onto that. But when that top tax rate is above 50%, things stabilize. When it's below 50%, things are extremely unpredictable and volatile economically. And that, I think, we should just you can't not acknowledge those numbers. And we've seen this in country after country, and we've seen it in the United States. We've had a top tax rate that was over 90% a couple of times. I mean, we had one during World War I as well, and things stabilized all of a sudden. It was quite remarkable. And then Harding came in 1920 and dropped the top tax rate from 91% down to 25% in 1921. And what did that do? It kicked off the bubble that led to the burst of 1929.
Well, I think I would say that the tax rate was secondary to ignoring the economy, ignoring the farm depression that never ended after 1920, ignoring the real estate bust that came in 1926 by Coolidge. I mean, he basically followed as you say, a libertarian policy of I'm not going to get involved in anything. Right. He knew, he's quoted as saying, Hoover's going to get a depression and he's never going to know what to do with it, which unfortunately was the case. But, I think right now we tax people who are making under $100,000 too much. We probably should cut those rates.
I agree.
We should remove the cap on FICA. And that, by the way, takes you over 50%. And cut sales tax and increase state income tax because the states are not in good shape either.
Yeah, I agree with all those things. I'm just saying that at the federal level, the top tax rate needs to go above 50%. History demonstrates it works best when it's above 50%.
Well, I think but the problem is the top tax rate is a combination of a number of things.
No, I'm talking about the federal, the very simple top federal tax rate.
Yeah, but I don't think you can do that. I think you have to look at the total tax rate. And if you're saying a federal tax rate of 90% in California, that almost puts you over 100% tax rate that people have to pay.
Yeah. But the fact of the matter is that state taxes are tax deductible at the federal level, so that's not going to happen. But I guess we're not going to convince each other. Bill, I check out this "Economists Say We Should Tax the Rich at 90% article that Ben Walsh wrote over at Huffington Post. I think you'll find it interesting. I'm going to move along. Bill, thank you for the call.